Hi guys, welcome to November's Dispatches. What you see before you today is a rather modest little collection, but some very nice additions to existing ranges and some ranges that we just started very recently. So let's begin with our Kokoda Diggers Fight Back. Now, in the last couple of months we launched the Kokoda campaign series about the Australian soldiers fighting against the Japanese in Papua New Guinea. The first few releases were just really an introduction to show the guys on patrol and going about their business in the jungle, but now we're actually down to action, and we've got a nice little release here of just 5 figures, but there's some really good ones among them. So let's begin with right down the front here, and it's our Vickers machine gunner. Now the Vickers machine gun was one of the most famous weapons for the British Army and the Commonwealth armies for both World Wars and even long after the Second World War. The gun itself was the first sort of general purpose heavy machine gun that was introduced into the British Army in 1912. The very last Vickers machine guns were taken out of service in 1968. So that's a run of something like 56 years on active service. Fantastic machine gun. I've never actually fired one, but I've sat behind one. I had my photograph taken. Really great machine gun. And we've got our gunner here surrounded by some ammunition boxes, and the gun of course is mounted on a tripod, and so it's laying down heavy support fire for the other diggers. Next to the Vickers machine gunner, we've got a single figure of the Bren gun. Bren guns again were another very long-held weapon by British and Commonwealth forces. First came into service in the late 1930s, originally based on a Czechoslovak design that was adapted by the British and saw lots of active service in World War II and well into even the Falklands campaign of 1982. Behind those are 3 riflemen. Again, all 3 Aussies have got the SMLE Mark III. SMLE stands for Short Magazine Lee Enfield, and this was the standard infantry weapon for all British and Empire forces from, I believe it was around 1903 onwards, and saw active service all the way up to 1958. Now the particular SMLE Mark III was probably the most numerous. The British changed over to the Mark IV in mid-1942, but the Australian Army kept theirs going all the way up until they changed over to the self-loading rifle, the L1A1, same as the British, in 1958, but they kept their World War I era Lee Enfields all the way through World War II, into Korea and beyond. Again, our little rifle section here, 3 very useful positions that always look good in a diorama, and I think you can take it from there. There's already more in the pipeline, but we'll talk about that some other time. But in the meantime, one other thing that you might notice is the little backdrop that you see here, and that's actually some of our Mexican village that we put together for a cattle drive series. Now from Papua New Guinea and the Kokoda Trail, let's go a little bit further north to Vietnam, or to be more precise, actually South Vietnam. And you'll see a little figure that I'm pointing to just now standing on top of this building, rather imposing figure of General William C. Westmoreland. General Westmoreland was the commander of all US Army forces in South Vietnam from 1964 to 1968. A very important person. He oversaw the growth of American forces go from somewhere in the region of 24,000 in 1964 up to a high of almost 500,000. In fact, more than 500,000. I think it was 540,000 by 1968 in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Westmoreland himself had very fixed ideas of how the war should be fought. And for most of his time as Army commander, he definitely enjoyed the support of President Lyndon Johnson in Washington and the chiefs of staff. And they really did believe that he was winning the war. And in fact, up until 1967, almost the end of 1967, he had been telling the folks back in Washington that the end was in sight, and the Vietnamese, or the North Vietnamese in particular, and the Viet Cong, were really on their last legs. What did it in for him was the fact that when the Tet Offensive struck in January 1968, it came as a huge surprise to everyone, including, I believe, himself, that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army could still mount this huge offensive. Now, it has to be said that under Westmoreland's leadership, the American forces and the South Vietnamese and their other allies actually defeated the Tet Offensive and decimated the Viet Cong. I mean, the Viet Cong, in fact, never really recovered from their defeat of the Tet Offensive. And after 1968, the majority of the fighting in South Vietnam was conducted by the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA. Because of the loss of confidence that the Tet Offensive caused back in America, it's often said that although the Americans won the Tet Offensive, the war was actually lost back in the States, because the mainstream media in America basically said that the war could no longer be won, or in their view could no longer be won. And from that point on, the American involvement started to wind down. Westmoreland himself was not sacked. He was actually moved up and sideways back to the States. His position as Commander-in-Chief of South Vietnam was handed over to Crichton W. Abrams, who again was a very well-known American general who did the best that he could under very difficult circumstances. Westmoreland would eventually go on to become, I believe, the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, and even ran West Point for the American U.S. Army's military academy for several years as well. Up until the very end of his life, he believed that he'd been betrayed by the politicians in Washington. So he's a very tragic character. Up until he moved to Vietnam, he had a fairly impressive military career, all the way through from the time he joined the army pre-World War II, through World War II, into Korea, and Vietnam was supposed to be the high point of his career. Instead, it wasn't quite the high point of his career, but it was where he achieved the most fame, or infamy, if you want to put it that way. But he definitely deserves a place in any history of the Vietnam War and of America's involvement. And that's why we've designed this, I think, one of our best little personality figures of a very striking and impressive military officer. From Vietnam, we're going to move across the table all the way to Normandy, and our latest release of 12th SS Hitler Jugend figures in action. Now again, if you know anything about the 12th SS, this was actually a division that was made up of relatively young men, 16, 17 and 18-year-old former members of the Hitler Youth that were brought together to form a division, and the leadership of that division was mostly chosen from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstander Adolf Hitler. So most of the officers and nearly all the NCOs were all veterans of fighting in Russia, and they definitely imbued this division with their fighting spirit, and unfortunately perhaps some of the fanaticism that grew out of the Hitler Youth as well, because this division itself had a good fighting reputation, but unfortunately also committed several major atrocities in Normandy during the Normandy campaign. The figures that you see before you, we've got, if I've counted correctly, 7 figures. We've got a machine gun team with the MG42, that's the 2 guys lying prone. We've got an officer with the, I think it's the MP44 assault rifle, and then we've got other figures with a mixture of rifles and MP40 submachine guns, and we've even got a signaller with the field radio. So really good, useful additions. Again, once more, they're wearing what we call mixed rig, which is a mixture of camouflage items, either the camouflage jacket or the camouflage trousers, and field grey jackets and trousers as well. And that was partly because there was all kinds of shortages in getting uniforms and bits of equipment to the division during the Normandy campaign, where the German logistics side of things broke down to some extent, and people had to make do with what they could get hold of and what they could find almost on the battlefield itself. So there you have it, 7 little figures, 1 2-figure set. I believe the rest are all sold individually, but good additions to what's been released previously. Now, on a lighter note, as we get near Christmas, we always have some Christmas releases. This year's no exception. Down the front here, you'll see our 2 brand new Christmas releases. One is Santa and the Polar Bear Express, and the other is Santa's Little Helper. Now, Santa's Polar Bear Express, last year we introduced a brand new Santa with one of his pet polar bears. This time round, Santa's decided to take the weight off his feet and use one of the polar bears as part of his transport platoon to maybe get him halfway around the world. And he's got his bag of goodies on the back, and again, one of his friendly polar bears is taking him out and about. Next to Santa is one of Santa's Little Helpers. This rather attractive young lady in a fairly flimsy costume. She is got her little bag of goodies that she's helping Santa out with in a few deliveries. And that particular set also comes with a very nice little set of presents and a little North Pole sign. So she will come with that. But that same little set also is with this little conglomerate set where we've got a little Victorian brother and sister carol singers with a little Victorian lamp, and the little snowman there, and that little North Pole sign, all at a very special gift set price. So great value, and I hope you like that as well. And over on the other side, you'll see our Christmas cottage. Now that also is available, and that comes with also the little North Pole sign, and that comes at a very special gift price set as well. So I hope you find something for your Christmas stocking there. Last year's were very popular, sold extremely well, and I hope this year's are just as popular. So on that cheerful note, I'll wish you all a very merry little Christmas until the next December release, but in the meantime, enjoy what you see here. Thank you.